I feel so thankful and honored to be here. Thank you very much to the Research Center. Thank you very much, Professor Min. And this is the first time I've been back on the Queens College campus since 1974 when I graduated from here with my BA. So I never imagined I would be returning as a speaker. In a 2017 volume of essays titled The Big Push, Cynthia Enloe, a feminist political scientist, reminds readers of the importance of language in shaping thought and therefore in shaping policy. She draws her example from recent controversies over the plight of refugees from Syria, controversies, as she points out, that have also involved the subject of child marriage in refugee communities. But that very way of naming the problem affects both attitudes and the kinds of initiatives being proposed. As Enloe asserts, quote, by adopting the phrase child marriages, one is suggesting that boys are just as likely as girls to be married while still in their childhood, and this is not true. Instead, as she makes clear, quote, in reality, these are not child marriages, they are girl marriages. Why does this matter? As Enloe explains, quote, each of us helps to sustain patriarchal ideas and practices when we hide the workings of gendered inequities behind a curtain of ungendered language, end quote. And this has consequences in terms of action or inaction, and in terms of who will benefit or who will not. Almost from the moment in the early 1990s when news of the systematic gendered war crimes committed by the Japanese Imperial Army across Asia throughout the Second World War first began to circulate, the issue of language and of what language makes visible or invisible has been inextricably bound up with this subject. As late as November 2014, Bloomberg News contained an account of the Japanese daily newspaper Yomiuri Shimbun apologizing to readers for the use of the term sex slaves in, quote, stories about Asian women trafficked to Japanese military brothels before and during World War II, end quote. That same U.S. news service quoted an unnamed official of the South Korean Foreign Ministry who raised objections to the alternative euphemism, quote, Japan's refusal to use the term sexual slavery and forcing the international community to use the ambiguous term comfort women distorts the core of the problem and can only be seen as an effort to whitewash its past mistakes, end quote. Whether one chooses, however, either military sex slaves or comfort women, the two most commonly used English phrases in Western political discourse, there is an inherent problem. As Cynthia Enloe helps us to recognize, military sex slaves is like child marriage, ungendered. It obscures the workings of gender inequities in underpinning and supporting the atrocities in question. But the alternative phrase, comfort women, masks a different reality. The so-called comfort women in the so-called comfort system, that system was built on the organized sexual assault of underage girls. The preferred victims in this governmentally approved plan for the mass trafficking, forcible confinement, and exploitation of their bodies. That so many of the Korean, Chinese, Filipina, and other Asian survivors who have testified about their experiences were between the ages of 12 and 19 when they were imprisoned in brothels demonstrates that this could be no accident and was no anomaly. It was instead a strategy that, among other things, ensured a greater power differential between the girl captives and the men who, on a daily basis, raped them, even when the latter were young soldiers themselves. It made the girl victims more vulnerable and thus easier to intimidate and to manage. As mere children and adolescents, they were less resourceful, less knowledgeable in general, and less likely to plan or survive escapes or be equipped to plot rebellion. In terms of political manifestations and ramifications, moreover, targeting underage girls was a shrewd move and a low-risk decision for Japanese officials. For in almost every culture around the world, young girls, those not yet wives or mothers, have long been considered the least valuable and most expendable members of families and of society as a whole. That is nearly as true today as it was in the 1930s and 40s. The removal and disappearance of large numbers of girls has always been less likely to incite mass uprisings than the taking of any other populations. Not surprisingly, in the case of the comfort system, it was the survivors themselves, rather than their home communities or their governments, who had to come forward in the early 1990s to lodge the first protests and to initiate the calls for apologies from Japan. Scholars rightly have pointed to factors such as class, given the lower class status of many of those subject to the comfort system, as influencing the lack of widespread public outrage and seeming indifference to these girls' fates across Asia and the West. But we cannot discount the fact that girl children have never embodied the same degree of social capital as the so-called sons of a nation. They were and are of lesser worth in their own societies and in the world as a whole. At certain moments in history, representations of young girls as victims of sexual assault by military forces have been disseminated in the West, and these have provoked strong reactions. This is not a sign, however, that the welfare of the girls themselves has ever been of great concern. Rather, images of helpless girl children attacked by monstrous enemy soldiers have proven useful for achieving specific political ends, often unrelated to any interest in the victims themselves. Earlier this year, you could have gone to the Museum of the City of New York and seen, in an exhibition titled Posters and Patriotism, Selling World War I in New York, an excellent example. The American artist Ellsworth Kelly's 1918 poster promoting the sale of bonds to support the war in Europe featured the warning, "Remember Belgium." Beneath these words was the silhouette of two figures, a large, adult, male German soldier wielding his phallic gun with one hand and with the other hand dragging behind him a young girl with long, loosened hair, clearly carrying her away for the purpose of rape. As Susan Kingsley Kent explains in Gender and Power in Britain, such images originated in Britain in 1915 as efforts to legitimate and justify the war itself. Thus, quote, "The official propaganda presented the war as a fight for and behalf of Belgium, casting Belgium in the role of a violated maiden left to die by cruel, inhuman invaders," end quote. The focus was less on the experiences of any actual young Belgian girls who may have been subject to sexual assault, and more on the political need to personify the Belgian nation as feminized and helpless. When considering, therefore, some of the visual representations of recruitment and forcible confinement of underage Asian girls by the Japanese Imperial Army, we must be cognizant of this history, a history, at least in the West, of making girl victims visible not for their own sake, in acknowledgement of their individual human value, but for their political utility as symbols. If I had more time, I would also take up the question of the non-visual literary representations that have been available to English-speaking audiences and consider how these have dealt with girl victims. These have included memoirs such as Maria Rosa Henson's 1999 Comfort Woman, along with mass-market fictional texts such as William Andrews' 2014 novel Daughters of the Dragon, both of which concentrate on the perspectives of girls who were 14 years old when they were first raped and confined. Given time constraints, I will merely offer remarks regarding a few of the visual images, since visual images have an immediacy that is so powerful, that have circulated through mass public culture, television, and films in the US, with a mention at the end of a topic that will probably come up later at this conference, that is the figurative memorial in bronze known as the Peace Statue. The visual representation of the comfort system viewed by the greatest number of people across the US was probably Open Wounds, a roughly 7-minute long segment of the weekly TV news magazine CBS Sunday Morning. Open Wounds, broadcast on the morning of March 18, 2007, was occasioned by the congressional hearings that led to the passage on July 30, 2007 of House Resolution 121. As you know, this resolution called on the government of Japan to formally acknowledge, apologize, and accept historical responsibility for what it described as, quote, the coercion of young women into sexual slavery. The CBS Sunday Morning feature began with a few stills drawn from now familiar images of small groups of comfort system survivors. A sparse handful of photos taken immediately after the end of the Second World War, although this report did not display any of the autobiographical paintings or drawings created by survivors in which they've depicted themselves as girl children or adolescents. In these photographs, it's difficult to tell precisely how old those recorded by the camera actually were. Nonetheless, the producers of this segment did not let the issue of age go unremarked. One of the now elderly survivors who briefly spoke on camera was Virginia Villamora, a Filipina victim of the comfort system, who declared that, quote, they, meaning the Japanese military, destroyed our lives. We have no bright tomorrows because of what they did to us. Before she uttered those words, the narrator of the segment announced, quote, Virginia Villamora was 14. It would have been clear, therefore, to viewers of this segment that a 14-year-old was by no means a, quote, young woman, and that the issue at hand was one involving child rape. Or, with Cynthia Enlow's proviso about gendered language in mind, the rape of girl children. At this moment in Open Wounds, the focus was both literally and figuratively on Virginia Villamora, not only as she appeared in 2007 while denouncing the war crimes committed against her and others, but as she appeared while still a girl, for the screen filled with a poignant black and white photo of her young self. Unlike the generic silhouette of the First World War Belgian rape victim, a mere prop in a larger argument, Virginia Villamora was allowed, if only briefly, to impress upon the audience the sense of her individual existence, while also speaking of the collective suffering shared by many in her situation. Yet, admirable as the sensitivity of the producers of this TV news segment may have been, their approach still fell into the trap that Dashiell Kim Gibson outlined nearly 20 years earlier in her important 1999 volume, Silence Broken. As she warned there, the form that attention to the survivors takes often risks being reductive. Quote, it is as if Their existence is justified solely by the horrendous years they suffered. Nothing before or after that seems to matter. They have largely become issues, numbers, things, and objects of studies, not full-blooded human beings," end quote. From open wounds, viewers did learn that many of the victims of the comfort system were underage girls. They did not, however, learn anything about the lives of the girls at the time that they were targeted for this war crime, or about how the experience of it at such a young age affected all that followed. Dashiell Kim Gibson herself tried to counter this limited form of representation in a 1999 documentary film with the same title, Silence Broken, that aired in the US on public television in the year 2000. The televised version, however, had to be edited drastically to 1 hour in length, which meant the removal of a great deal of footage. Much of what was cut involved docudrama, that is, staged reenactments of episodes from the lives and experiences of comfort system victims and survivors. Thus, the dramatic impact of making visible the actuality of very young girls living through horrendous war crimes was lost. Nonetheless, the edited version retained footage of interviews with elderly survivors who came alive on screen as fully realized individuals with powerful personalities. So too, the shortened documentary repeatedly underscored the age at which girls had been victimized, with one of the elderly speakers testifying to having been only 12 years old when she was taken, and saying of others, quote, "Some of them look 12, 13, 14, 15, such young children," end quote. In recent years, human rights activists have paid greater attention to the issue of sex trafficking of children, while feminist activists have highlighted the trafficking of girl children as ongoing global phenomena. This enhanced awareness has encouraged representations of the issue not only as a vindication of how that must be recognized and eradicated in the present, but as one with historical roots, as a crime that occurred in the past that was left unaddressed and unresolved. In terms of the circulation of visual images related to the comfort system, this new concern has certainly helped to spur contemporary representations of the victims as underage girls. I've been told I have only 5 minutes, and I'm going to cut a lot of what I would love to tell you about, which is about the 2 films, Spirit's Homecoming and Snowy Road, that have been seen in the US on college campuses, in theaters, and available in DVDs. And I'm going to go all the way to the end. Why does this shift in the terms of representation matter? Both a linguistic change with greater inclusion of the words girls and girl children in discussions of the Japanese comfort system, and the change in visual representation to highlight the issue of age rather than gender, class, or ethnicity alone. For Western allies of the survivors and their supporters, such a shift ought to mean an equivalent change in how we represent and educate about this history. We need to recognize, teach, and write about this war crime, not only as an example of wartime sexual slavery, but as having been frequently, and in numerous cases, a violation of those defined as minors under Japan's own laws, which at the time of the Second World War set the age of adulthood at 21. This was a conscious and deliberate crime of sex trafficking of minor girls, and thus of institutionalized and gendered child rape of girls. The Japanese government has offered no apology or official acknowledgement of that universally abhorrent criminal act. And this is surely the Japanese government's worst nightmare, to be exposed as having, throughout the war, instituted and overseen a military brothel system that knowingly targeted minor girls, who, under no legal definition of consent, even under Japan's own laws, could have been capable of consenting to such recruitment. It explains, I believe, the vociferous protests by the same government against the proliferation of images of what is known as the peace statue, an unmistakable representation in bronze now being positioned outside Japanese embassies in South Korea and elsewhere around the world of a comfort system victim who is not a woman, but a girl child. Photographs of this statue are currently circulating throughout the West via newspaper accounts and reaching many viewers in the US, even in places where the statue itself has not been erected. Knowledge of it is being disseminated further through the 2016 Canadian documentary, The Apology, written and directed by Tiffany Seung, which in its DVD release includes a special feature that shows the 2011 unveiling of the peace statue in Seoul at a Wednesday demonstration. To finish, as someone who, for over 2 decades, has followed the progress and setbacks of the movement for redress, I have never felt more pessimistic about the prospects of the Japanese government agreeing to its demands. On the other hand, I have never felt more optimistic about the spread of popular awareness, outrage, and determination to pursue the historical truth about the comfort system. Over time, different aspects of it stand out with greater clarity and greater prominence. Right now, thanks in part to increased visual representation, these facets include the element of age. We all look forward to seeing what other elements come into view next to inform our future work, which must and will go on. Thank you.